little bit of context as to what made this story absolutely horrifying. A few years ago, I owned a farm in northern Maine for about 2 years before selling it to a rancher. The farm wasn't anything too crazy. It was just a simple barn house and a small cabin. While it may not have been the nicest farm, the view it had was amazing. Rolling hills, grasslands, and just the overall countryside of the state. I owned the farm itself, but I never made the effort to actually live there as it's too much money to maintain and I just wasn't ready for it. Most farmers dream of the idea to live on their farm, but they often fail to realize how expensive it really is. That said, I still went up to my farm pretty often to watch over my livestock and help maintain it the best I can. Sometimes I paid my buddy Frank to do it for me, but that wasn't always the case. One day, Frank had fell sick and couldn't make it that day. This was during the peak of the pandemic, so I sort of understood. This meant that I had to go over to do it myself, which I didn't mind, but it was very demanding and I had to get stuff done. Anyway, I drive about a good 45 minutes to my farm and instantly noticed the barn door had been left slightly open. This obviously angered me, as I always tell Frank to remember to lock the doors. I sigh and get out of my car and walk over to the barn house, and as I'm about to open the door, I get a weird feeling. Looking back, I wasn't sure why I had this feeling, but something inside me told me not to open the door. I tried to erase these feelings as me just being paranoid, but the more I did, the worse the feeling became. Assuming that it was probably Frank being a dumbass and forgetting to lock the barn, I call him up, confronting him about it. However, after explaining myself, he didn't know what I was talking about and said that he did lock it. That's when I turn over to the barn doors and see that the latch to lock the doors had been broken. Broken as in cut, tampered with, which made the latch fall to the ground. Needless to say, I apologized to Frank and told him that there could have been someone in the barn. At this point, I'm still on the phone with Frank, and he tells me that I should go inside the cabin to check the cameras before inspecting the barn. Most of the time, I don't really take advice from anyone, but for some reason, I decided to listen. The barn has several cameras installed, 2 on the outside and 1 on the inside. Anyway, I opened my laptop to check the cameras, and what I saw absolutely shook me. Inside of the barn was someone standing there next to the main doors, presumably waiting for me to go inside. Whoever this was probably heard my car approaching and hid inside the barn. The camera quality wasn't the best, but I could see that they appeared to have something in their hands. Based on their movements, they tried to act stealthy in an attempt to not make any noise. Thank God I didn't end up walking in, and thank God for Frank. I tell Frank everything and told him that I was gonna call the sheriff. Thankfully, the sheriff's office isn't too far, so I knew they wouldn't be long. As a request, I asked for them to turn off their sirens to not scare whoever was in my barn. Thankfully, they get here in a matter of minutes and arrest the person who turned out to be my neighbor's son. Somehow, he had found out that Frank wasn't here today and took that chance to do God knows what. Police searched him, but had found nothing that was stolen. I remember his parents begging me not to press charges, but I didn't even bother listening. The scariest part about this is what his intentions were. Had I not called Frank to tell him about the lock, things probably would have turned out differently for me had I been so dumb. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to.
About 5 years ago, my uncle owned a farm out in the Midwest for about 18 years or so. He loved that place like his own wife, and treated it like a home. Granted, he already owned a house on the farm, but there was something about his farm itself that made him feel special. You know that feeling you get when something brings joy to you but aren't able to tell what it is? Yeah, that's exactly how he felt. Anyway, I was 19 at the time of this story and was in my first semester in college. My uncle asked me to watch over his farm for the weekend as he would be out of town for a work company event which would require him to travel out of state. As much as he despised doing this, he had to pay the bills somehow, and that's just how it was. My uncle agreed to pay me $500 for the weekend, which was good enough for me. At the time, I had been saving up for a car, so I could really use the $500. My dad had driven well over an hour just to drop me off at my uncle's ranch, which I thanked him for, as it wasn't easy on him. My uncle had left me a list of responsibilities I had to do on the farm, which were just simple tasks you'd expect. Cleaning the house, feeding the animals, fertilizing, harvesting the crops, etc. A lot of these tasks were pretty hands-on, but I got them done with ease. The first night went pretty well with getting everything done as well as getting myself situated. It wasn't until the second night where something happened that chilled me to the bone. It was a quiet night with light rain, which made for the perfect night to watch a movie. If I remember correctly, I was watching one of the Jurassic Park movies, when all of a sudden, I hear my uncle's cattle going absolutely hysterical. At that moment, I ran out of the front door with my raincoat and went into the barn where the cattle were. What I saw absolutely floored me. All of the cows seemed to be in great distress by something. Now, I thought that it could have been the rain, but why would a small storm cause them to be in such distress? Whatever the reason was, I knew something had spooked the cattle. After a few minutes, they seemed to calm down, and with that I returned to the house to finish my movie. It was around 11 p.m, and the movie had ended. I decided to call it a night and got into my bed to go to sleep. Just as I was getting into bed, I heard the cattle going haywire again. Annoyed out of my mind at this point, I put on my boots and go out to the barn. Once I open the doors, the cattle are practically screaming and being in distress about something. All the while, I'm trying to figure out what it is that's making them anxious, when I begin hearing what I could only describe as bangs coming from the roof. That's exactly what I heard. Multiple bangs on top of the roof. It's safe to assume that there was someone on top of the roof that was causing the cattle to become distressed. I step out of the barn, climbing the roof to give the person a piece of my mind. Just as I put my foot on the ladder of the barn, I hear this person make this terrible scream that echoed across the woods. I'll be honest, it didn't even sound human. However, to my surprise, the second I got on top, there was not a soul in sight. Mind you, this barn was massive, so if there was someone up here, there was no way they could have just jumped down without breaking something. Yes, the barn had a ladder, but I would have seen someone coming down if there was someone. I basically tossed the whole barn trying to look for this person, but was unable to find them. By this point, the cows seemed to be a lot calmer, and after a good few minutes of searching, I went back to the house and finally got some sleep. The next morning, I called my uncle and mentioned that there was someone on the roof of the barn who was causing his cattle to become irritated. My uncle responded in a confused tone, telling me that he had installed security lights on the barn, so there was virtually no way someone could get up there without setting off the lights and alarm. The whole situation really freaked us out. Also, if you're thinking that it could have been some malfunction with the security system, you're wrong. My uncle had it installed 2 weeks ago, and it's a pretty reliable system, claimed my uncle. The rest of my stay went accordingly, but don't think for a second that I wasn't scared of who or whatever the hell was on the roof that night. Like I said, my uncle owned his farm for a long time, so when he learned about this incident, he was clearly freaked out by it. On the last night of my stay, I could have sworn that I had heard tapping on the roof of the house, only for it to completely stop a minute later. It very well could have been the rain or just me hearing things, but maybe that's just because I'd rather not think of what else it could have been. Long story short, a few years later, my uncle's farm unfortunately suffered a huge fire caused by a lightning storm. He had already given most of his cows away to some ranchers in need of them, so luckily they were okay. Ever since my encounter, I've come up with several theories as to what could have been on the roof that night. My leading theory is that it was a person, either messing with me or had some intentions that weren't so good. However, the problem with this theory is that I would have seen the person, and there's no way they could jump off the barn with it being that high. My other theory is that it was some sort of animal. That theory too has problems that are too complex for me to dive into. It was either one of those things, or perhaps something more sinister I probably didn't want to see. And that scream? It was unlike anything I've ever heard. I now have somewhat of a fear of farms and ranches, and always try my best to avoid rural areas.
My wife Carol and I owned a farm in upstate Iowa where we mainly growed and sold corn and other crops. We never made a ton of money from it, but we made enough to at least maintain the farm. We spent a good portion of our lives on the farm caring for it and just doing the best we can. This happened in October of 2017 on a slightly rainy night. Carol had just finished feeding the cattle and came into the house so we could just have the night to ourselves and stay in. I brought up the idea that we should watch a movie as there wasn't much to do on the farm, especially when it was raining. I remember we saw some 80s romance film that I forget the name of, which sort of made us fall asleep on the couch. I'd say we were asleep for a good couple of hours when I for some reason woke up. You know that jolt motion you have when you just suddenly wake up for practically no reason? Yeah, that's exactly what I felt, and I wasn't sure why. Carol was still asleep and I didn't want to wake her up, so I got up to go fix myself a snack when I look up at the kitchen window. At this point, it's still dark out, but even then, I thought I could see something propped up against the fence. I found myself moving my hand towards the light switch, debating on whether or not to turn on the outside light. For some reason, I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination and gathered up the courage to do it. The second I turned on the light, I felt my blood run cold and stepped back in absolute horror. Standing about maybe a few feet in front of the fence is this dirty-looking man holding a wrench above his head. He was not a pleasant-looking guy at all. He appeared to be maybe in his late 50s, wore torn clothing, and was wearing a baseball cap. Specifically my baseball cap I always left inside the house. After a few moments, I processed as to what this meant and realized something. The guy had been inside of my house for God knows how long, and we didn't even notice. I took a few seconds to compose myself while this man is still out there with the wrench while giving me this unsettling smile. What made it even more disturbing was the fact that he was missing some teeth. In that moment, I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to wake up my wife and scare her, and my guns were in the other room. However, I didn't want to leave the kitchen, fearing he'd smash the window and climb through. It was then when I remembered that I had an outside speaker that you could activate from inside of the kitchen. I turned it on and thank God it still worked, as we almost never use it. I told this man in a demanding voice to get lost and that we were armed. Unfortunately, this didn't seem to faze him as he still stood there watching me. With nothing to really do, I book it to my room and grab my .45 and go back to the kitchen where he's still there. I sort of present my gun to let him know that I was armed and fire a shot through the window, purposely missing him. This caused him to jolt, and I speak into the speaker once again. "We are armed, get the fuck out of here!" Finally, after a long 10 minutes of my encounter with this man, he finally turns back, disappearing into the night. What made his departure so abnormal and unsettling was the way he walked away. He sort of just left so casually, as if nothing had happened. It was the type of walk you'd see from someone when they're sad that they got rejected by their high school crush. I don't know why this stuck with me, it was just very uncomfortable. My wife had woken up from the commotion, freaked the hell out while begging me to tell me what I did. I told her everything and told her to go back to sleep. We didn't bother calling the police as we live in a rural area and, let's be honest, there's not much they can do. I just hope that whoever was on my farm that night still has some sense to never come back. Next time, I might not be so nice.